Welcome to Figments of the Brain, a philosophy podcast recorded at the University of Cologne. Figments of the Brain is produced by Concept, the Cologne Center of Contemporary Epistemology and the Kantian tradition. Every episode we pick a topic for a roundtable discussion among the members of Concept. Sometimes we also interview other philosophers on a selected topic. We welcome your feedback. To get in touch and learn more about the center, please visit www.concept-phil.de. That's www.concept-phil.de. We hope you enjoy our podcast.
So this is the fourth installment of this. I guess we've been hosting Colloquia for a little while now, but this is number 4 of whenever we began to title it The Knowledge Router since the pandemic. And thank you for joining us. Alix Cohen's going to be giving today's talk, as you all know. You all probably know a fair bit about her and her prolific work on Kant and bringing Kant into more of the analytic tradition as it's seen. She took her PhD from Cambridge. She's been at the University of Edinburgh since 2014. She has, as I think I've already mentioned, published much on Kant. And today's talk is entitled In Defense of Epistemic Autonomy, a Kantian Proposal. And after Alix gives her talk, Federica Malfatti will give comments. She's a postdoc at the University of Innsbruck, and Reza Hadisi, will then follow with additional comments. And he's an assistant professor at the University of Arizona. And with that, Alix, please take us away.
So thanks so much for having me, especially in a kind of more different crowd from what I'm used to, because as Paul said, I'm a Kantian, and so I'm used to talking to Kantians, and so it's kind of exciting, but also a little bit scary to have a mixed audience of Kantians and epistemologists. So so I'll be curious to see how my Kantian gibberishes translates to epistemologists. So as Paul said, what I'm going to talk about today is part of a larger project, and that project is to kind of use Kantian resources, and especially Kantian resources in kind of moral or practical philosophy, and use them as a base or as a ground or as a model to think about epistemic normativity. And so I've done that in various contexts, but this paper today is a kind of newish reflections I have around the idea of epistemic autonomy. And I mean, the way I situate this kind of question within contemporary epistemology, which obviously I don't know very well, but I've tried to kind of familiarize myself with, is that there's been a lot of recent criticisms of epistemic consequentialism. And so my thought was, well, obviously epistemic autonomy has to be like the second favorite, the new place to be in epistemology. And so when I started looking at it, I was kind of surprised to see that it wasn't. And so when I looked at the few mentions of epistemic autonomy in contemporary literature, I saw that it was generally kind of seen in negative lights. And I think what explains this apparent lack of, obviously there are some exceptions, and Zabzebski and so on have talked about it, but it's relatively in the minority. And I think the reason for this, or one of the reasons why for this lack of enthusiasm, is that recent discussions of epistemic autonomy tend to describe it as an account that champions epistemic individualism. And that's to the point where on these kind of pictures, the subject is really seen as the only legitimate source of her beliefs. And of course, if that's an accurate description of epistemic autonomy, it's obvious to me that one should be suspicious of that. And in effect, the kind of objections that have been raised against the idea of epistemic autonomy tend to converge on the claim that insofar as human knowledge requires epistemic cooperation, and that seems to be uncontroversial, then epistemic autonomy, insofar as it champions epistemic individualism, is at best an unreachable ideal and at worst a non-starter. And so I guess the main claim in this paper will be to challenge the equation of epistemic autonomy and epistemic individualism. And so I'll try to put forward a Kantian account that doesn't fall prey to this kind of thing. But before I do that, I'll have a very brief kind of survey of what I found on epistemic autonomy in contemporary debates. So as I said, there's different versions of this kind of view, but they all converge around kind of similar group of notions of self-reliance, self-sufficient. Oh, sorry, I forgot that I have the PowerPoint presentation. There we are. Okay, so second slide away. So I was chatting and I forgot. Yes, so they converge around notions of self-reliance, self-sufficiency, independence, and sometimes even egoism. So on the slide, I've put a few examples. Elizabeth Fricker, the epistemically autonomous agent relies on no one else for any of her knowledge, thus she takes no one else's word for anything, but accepts only what she has found out for herself, relying only on her own cognitive faculties and investigative and inferential powers. Duncan Pritchard, who used to be one of my colleagues, said intellectual autonomy is the good of being epistemically self-reliant. And Linda Zadetsky says epistemic autonomy is often described in a way that makes it indistinguishable from epistemic egoism. So we have very much this kind of connection between autonomy and individualism or egoism. Now that's the view in contemporary literature. And of course, some people have associated this view with Kant. So John O'Neill, for instance, says Kant's writings on enlightenment. Oh, sorry, yes. Kant's writings on enlightenment do tend to assume epistemic self-sufficiency as a condition of intellectual autonomy. Or Friedrich Schmidt says Kant remains an individualist in the sense that all creative work is one's own, which of course rules out testimony. And Encabo says the enlightened ideal of an autonomous intellectual life seems to be committed to a certain version of epistemological individualism. So the views attributed to Kant, now, is it rightly attributed to Kant? Well, of course, there's some textual support for it. Famously, the motto of the Enlightenment, have courage to make use of your own understanding, sapere aude, and all the rest. I even have it on a mug. Someone gave it to me for my birthday. So Kant is famously associated with that. And there's also one of the three maxims of common understanding, which is think for yourself. So of course, there are grounds for thinking that Kant embraced a kind of epistemic individualism, in the sense that the subject, the epistemically responsible subject, must use her own cognitive faculties alone. Although actually, just going back to the passages I quoted, when he says, have courage to make use of your understanding, he doesn't say alone, it just says use your understanding. So I think that's the first sign that maybe he doesn't have this kind of at the exclusion of anything else. But anyway, so say that could be attributed to Kant on this basis. Now there are good reasons for rejecting this view, whether as a Kantian view or as a view in general. And I think, again, there's two kind of group of objections that are actually distinct groups, but kind of are both, in a way, grounded on what you may want to identify as a Kantian view. So first is the thought that epistemic autonomy is irrational as a position. So Frigger, again, she says the supposedly ideal epistemic... Oh, yes, I'm on the right side, sorry. The supposedly ideal epistemically autonomous agent who trusts no one else's word is shown to be really an irrational dogmatist, for such extreme purism restricts how much one can come to know very severely. So it's irrational to be an epistemically autonomous agent, because how could you possibly want that and yet want to know at the same time? It's not a position you can hold. And Hartwig says, if I were to pursue epistemic autonomy across the board, I would succeed only in holding relatively uninformed, unreliable, crude, untested, and therefore irrational beliefs. So first problem with autonomy is that it's an irrational position to hold. Second one is that it's actually inconsistent. So it's more a problem that is internal to it. So for instance, again, John O'Neill says, Kant allows for reliance on testimony, but this epistemic dependence on others is problematic from a Kantian perspective because it is a source of heteronomy. So I can't have both at the same time. For we disclaim responsibility for using our own understanding. And Zadetsky again, epistemic autonomy as widely understood is incoherent, for it leaves us epistemically insecure, given that many people are untrustworthy. Why should I be any more secure if I rely on myself? So they're different objections, but they kind of boil down to the same thing. Either I need to trust others and thus blah, blah, or if I don't trust others, then I shouldn't trust myself either. So it's inconsistent either way, in a way. but for different reasons. Okay, so lots of objections already, lots of problems, lots of worries about epistemic autonomy. And so against all these problems, I'm going to try to focus and defend two claims. So the first one is that it is actually a misinterpretation of Kant's account, and that on my reading of Kant, epistemic autonomy is not individualistic, nor does it require epistemic self-reliance, independence, or self-sufficiency. Rather, I will argue that epistemic autonomy is self-legislation at the level of our epistemic principles, and that it prescribes that our cognitive faculties ought to be the source of the laws that govern their activities. So that's how I understand self-legislation. And secondly, I will argue that Kantian epistemic autonomy actually requires the epistemic contributions of others as its condition of possibility. And so epistemic autonomy does not give rise to, however, it does so in a way that does not give rise to epistemic heteronomy. And so in this sense, epistemic autonomy is compatible with epistemic communitarianism. And in fact, I will argue that there are two sides of the same coin. Okay, so I'm going to try to do that very quickly if I can. So first, this notion of epistemic maxims and their norms. So to begin with, I think it's important to note that on my reading of Kant, the demand for epistemic autonomy doesn't apply directly to beliefs, for we have no direct doxastic control over our beliefs. Rather, and this is something that kind of relies on previous work, so I can't really expand it, but obviously I'd be happy to explain in the Q&A. So we have no doxastic control of our beliefs, but rather, so the demand for epistemic autonomy applies to beliefs indirectly through what I've called our epistemic maxims and the principles that regulate them. So some of you may be familiar with the Kantian account of moral maxims. So they are the maxims that guide my actions. They are, quote, the subjective principles of acting, the principles in accordance with which the subject acts. Less familiar, of course, are my epistemic maxims. And on my interpretation, they are my epistemic strategy. That is to say, how I should cognize the world and how I can make the best use of my cognitive abilities. They are in effect the subjective principles that regulate the exercise of my cognitive agency. So for instance, I should proportion my beliefs according to evidence. I should not believe something on the grounds that it makes me feel better. Or I should not ignore evidence in cases when it falsifies a belief I desire to be true. Now, this view of the role of maxims in our cognitive agency entails that any kind of learning or believing is actually based on an epistemic maxim, whether you're conscious of it or not. And so on this view, there's no such thing as simply learning a fact or taking in information. My beliefs are always the result of an exercise of epistemic agency. And in this respect, believing isn't a normatively neutral exercise of my cognitive capacities, and as such, it should be regulated by a number of normative constraints. Believing responsibly thus consists in ensuring that the epistemic maxims that guide my beliefs are subject to the right kind of norms. And so we should think of these norms as second-order epistemic principles that regulate the first-order epistemic maxims that guide my cognitive activity. And this includes holding a belief, acquiring a belief, and just exercising cognitive agency in general. And so in this sense, and it's intentional, it really does mirror, for those of you who are familiar with Kant's ethics, it really does mirror the kind of hierarchy of principles and maxims that you find in ethics. But anyway, yeah, I can return to that later. And so because we have this mirroring, my claim is that the normative demands at play in the exercise of epistemic agency are analogous to those in moral agency. And they're analogous not only in their structure, as in both cases we have categorical demands made upon the way we use our cognitive agencies, but they're also analogous in terms of their principles. And that's kind of a key claim I made, and it's something I've been developing for a while in other papers. So as some of you may know, in Kantian ethics, you've got the various formulas that you're meant to use to kind of help regulate or determine your maxims. And of course, the formula of autonomy is one of the most famous ones. There's also, for instance, the formula of universal law, and I've written a paper about that. But so what I'm going to defend today is that there is a formula of epistemic autonomy that plays a similar role to the formula of autonomy that you find in Kant's ethics. So what is this formula? Well, so the famous one, the kind of ethical one, is act so that the will could regard itself as giving universal law through its maxim. Now, of course, there's an immense amount of literature on this formula, and in a way, I'm not so interested in a particular interpretation of that formula. Rather, what I want to defend, the claim is that there's an epistemic version of that. And so, on my reading of this formula, what's important is that, and especially what distinguishes this formula from other formula, is that the formula of autonomy grounds practical normativity on the agent as a rational lawgiver. It identifies the fact that what the ground of universal law is the agent as a rational being that gives itself its own law. So the agent's rational capacities ought to be the source of the maxims that bind her, the agent, and it is thereby that it ensures both her autonomy, so the autonomy of the agent, and the universality of the maxim. So you get both autonomy and universality in one swoop, so to speak, because the ground is precisely the agent as rational lawgiver. So what does the work is the rational and the law. Okay. So now I want to argue there's an epistemic version of that, the formula of epistemic autonomy, and it could be something like believe, and by believe for the Kantians amongst you, I mean holding to be true. So believe so that your cognitive faculties could regard themselves as giving universal law through all their maxims. And so, just as in the moral case, this formula grounds epistemic normativity on the agent as rational lawgiver. It prescribes that her cognitive faculties should be the source of the laws that govern their activities. And so we have the kind of parallel moral maxims, epistemic maxims, in the case of the formula of autonomy. So now, to actually give some meat to this account, because it seems rather formal, let me discuss epistemic heteronomy in the hope that it will give you a sense of what's at stake and why we should care about autonomy. So Kant writes that the tendency toward heteronomy of reason is called prejudice. Now, of course, we all think of prejudice as some kind of unjustified belief, but that's not the way Kant thinks about prejudice. Prejudice for Kant is an illegitimate principle that we have adopted as our maxim. He says, prejudice is a maxim of judging objectively from subjective grounds. Now, there are three kinds of subjective grounds that can play this role in Kant. First, there is inclinations. So, for instance, believe what I wish to be true. That's a prejudice maxim that uses inclination as a subjective ground. Second kind of subjective ground, habit. So, for instance, believe what I have always believed, no matter what. And the third kind of subjective ground is imitation. So, for instance, believe what my parents believe. Now, of course, all these maxims seem very different, but what they have in common is that they are impermissible, they are prejudiced. Why? Well, because they prescribe the use of merely subjective, non-rational grounds as objective. And by non-rational, I mean, so for instance, inclination, habits, and imitations, those are all not irrational, but just not rational for Kant. And we use them as if they were objective, as if they were sufficient to ground a belief. Now, on my reading, what this means is that by adopting these prejudice maxims to regulate our beliefs, we believe heteronomously. For when we choose to be guided by these maxims, the activity of our cognitive faculties is governed by principles that stem from, in Kantian jargonese, our lower faculties. That is to say, sources that are outside the higher faculty of cognition. And so, in a nutshell, our lower faculties would be things like sensibility, lower feeling, desire, inclinations, passions, and so on. Whereas our higher faculties, and especially our higher cognitive faculties, would be things like theoretical reason, the understanding, or the power of judgment. Now, what I've showed is that when you're guided by these prejudice maxims, you are governed by principles that stem from your lower faculties. So believe as your parents believe, imitation. And I think that it's in light of the possibility of this kind of epistemic heteronomy that a cognitive activity is subject to a normative demand for autonomy. As responsible epistemic agents, we ought to believe autonomously in the sense that we ought not adopt beliefs that have grounds that do not stem from our cognitive faculties. Rather, we ought to adopt beliefs that have grounds that do stem from our cognitive faculties. And so those would be, the obvious ones, so subjective, objective grounds, such as evidence, proof, argument, memory, reliable perception, all these kind of things. Now, just to clarify the view, I don't mean to imply that merely following the right kind of maxim is sufficient to ensure that the belief thereby acquired is either true or justified. First, a good maxim does not guarantee a true belief, since truth doesn't automatically come out of the normative process. For Kant, deploying maxims requires the exercise of what he calls a practice faculty of judgment. And it is through judgment that we determine what counts as a sufficient ground, what constitutes reliable evidence, or what makes a hypothesis probable, for instance. So even having the right epistemic maxim leaves plenty of room for differences of opinion, for arguments, disagreements, and thus for false beliefs. So in this sense, I think that it's a fallibilist conception of justification. A belief can be based on an excellent maxim and have sufficient grounds and yet turn out to be false. So that was the first point. The second point, and that's also to clarify the view, merely following the right kind of maxim is not sufficient to make you a good epistemic agent. Rather, you need to reflect on why a belief is justified in light of the maxim in order to gain insight into its rightness, into what makes the belief right in light of the maxim. And so without it, you can't really understand or generalize or replicate the justificatory process. Think of mathematics, you need to kind of go through the proof yourself to kind of truly understand the rightness of the belief. And so crucially, you need to self-legislate the maxim to be able to gain insight into the rightness of the maxim and then apply it correctly. Otherwise, chances are you probably make mistakes. Okay, so what I hope to have showed by now is that it makes sense to talk about something like epistemic autonomy, and that within a Kantian picture, autonomy is not just a matter of practical reason, it's also a matter of cognitive agency. Now, this conception of autonomy, the one I've defended, may actually give rise to worries about the individualistic nature of Kant's account. Because if you agree with me that epistemic autonomy consists in self-legislating your own maxim and your own epistemic principles, and grounding your beliefs on rational grounds that you choose, is it really better than a kind of most sophisticated kind of Kantian version of the epistemic individualism that I was worried about at the beginning of the paper? In other words, why isn't this version of epistemic autonomy subject to the same shortfalls as epistemic individualism? Now, I'm going to try to show that why it's not the case. And I'll do that by making an even stronger claim. So I won't just argue that it doesn't give rise to individualism. I'll argue that epistemic autonomy is actually constitutively, in a way, communitarian rather than individualistic. So to begin with, it's interesting to note that Kant is actually very well aware of the dangers of epistemic individualism, and it's a position that he calls the logical egoist, who, I quote, considers it unnecessary also to test his judgment by the understanding of others, as if he had no need at all for this touchstone. So by contrast with the epistemically autonomous agent, who cares about what he thinks is true, the logical egoist seems to care about being the master of his own thoughts. But what he really cares about is his subjective point of view, what he thinks is true, not what he thinks is true, if this is somehow conveyed. And so thereby, the logical egoist subordinates truth to his private point of view by valuing his own judgment over and above everyone else's judgment. So of course, I'm not saying that the logical egoist doesn't think that what he believes is true. Of course, I'm sure he does. But the point is that he values his subjective point of view over that of others, and that this happens at the expense of truth. Furthermore, and crucially for my account, Kant contrasts the logical egoist with what he calls the broad-minded thinker, who has an extended mode of thought. So here's a passage from the third critique. He sets himself apart from the subjective private conditions of the judgment and reflects on his own judgment from a universal standpoint. So on my reading, the function of this universal standpoint, or this extended mode of thought, is precisely to ensure that epistemic autonomy doesn't lead to epistemic individualism. And so it expresses the importance of others' points of view and shows that the epistemically autonomous agent is nothing like the logical egoist. He's not a self-reliant, self-sufficient individualist cognizer. And in fact, I believe that he's really the opposite of the self-reliant individualist. To see why I think that, let's turn to this passage, which is from the first critique. So Kant writes, the experiment that one makes on the understanding of others to see if the grounds that are valid for us have the same effect on the reason of others is a means, though only a subjective one, for revealing the merely private validity of the judgment. So lots in this passage, but what I think it suggests most importantly is that the possibility of others' agreement is necessary to ascertain that I am truly thinking autonomously, rather than just well. Because the epistemic function of others' agreement is to ensure that I don't hold beliefs on the basis of my mere subjective perspective, and in particular my prejudices, like I've discussed before. In this sense, epistemic reliance on others is necessary for epistemic autonomy, because thinking autonomously is not just using my own judgment rather than using other people's judgment. It's using my own judgment in a way that others can not only understand, but more importantly, agree with, at least in principle, even if in practice they disagree. And this is what Kant calls the possibility of communication. He writes, the touchstone of whether taking something to be true is conviction or mere persuasion is therefore externally the possibility of communicating it and finding it to be valid for the reason of every human being to assent to it. So I should not assent to a belief unless I consider the possibility of others' agreement. For unless others can agree with it, my belief cannot possibly be justified. And so communicability is a formal condition of holding legitimate beliefs. It's some kind of criterion of communicability. Objectively grounded beliefs are beliefs that are communicable. Now, of course, this is rather familiar in the Kantian literature. This idea of communicability, I mean, there's nothing new there, although it's obviously interesting, but it plays a crucial role in my argument, because I think what it shows is that epistemic autonomy requires epistemic communitarianism. Or to put it in a more straightforward way, the criterion of communicability is the reason why epistemic autonomy is not individualistic, but communitarian. By requiring that we take up the perspective of others, epistemic autonomy presupposes a community of knowers as its condition of possibility. So it is constitutively communitarian. The community, the autonomous subject must think of himself as a member of a community in order to be able to think autonomously. So it's a rather strong claim. Now, of course, the condition of communicability, as I've spelled it out now, is a formal condition, but it's not sufficient. It requires additional material condition, because considering the possibility of others' agreement requires first communicating with others, and second, relying on their testimony, because that's how I know what they think, if they tell me. So I cannot be an autonomous knower on my own, and that's true both in principle and in practice. And that's in comparison with, by contrast with what Kant calls the narrow-minded thinker, So Cohen writes about him. It's funny, I always notice that for the bad epistemic agents, I always say they're he, and then the good ones, I always say they're she. I apologize, it's just kind of. So his mode of thought is limited. He cannot put himself in the place of another, but judges merely from his own standpoint in his own way, and never sees a matter from another point of view. That's the narrow-minded thinker. And so by contrast with a narrow-minded thinker, the autonomous cognizer considers the point of view of others as rational beings. And it's the only way she can ensure that she is truly autonomous and that the grounds of her beliefs are not merely subjective, but rather objective. And so it's on this basis that I believe that Kant's normative epistemology is constitutively communitarian. Adopting the standpoint of other people is necessary for the exercise of epistemic autonomy. And this is why I think Kant writes, the opposite of egoism can only be pluralism, that is, the way of thinking in which one is not concerned with oneself as the whole world, but rather regards and conducts oneself as a mere citizen of the world. Now, this is a great quote for many reasons, but I think it really encapsulates, at least for me, how I understand Kant's account of epistemic normativity and what it means to be a responsible epistemic agent. Believing as an epistemic egoist is in effect seeing yourself as the whole world. That is to say, as the one and only legitimate source of belief. So the epistemic egoist is the epistemic individualist, like all these people said at the beginning. But by contrast, believing as a mere citizen of the world is in effect seeing yourself as part of a community of agents who share a world. So the sharing the world is the epistemic communitarianism part, and are equally committed to reason's demand, and that's the autonomous part. It's being committed to reason's demand that makes you autonomous, and it's seeing yourself as sharing the world with other epistemic agents that gives you the community part. And that's why not only is epistemic autonomy compatible with epistemic communitarianism, the latter is really a necessary condition of the former. So it's a kind of strong claim. Now, there may be maybe further worries, namely that by introducing a communitarian dimension, I actually threaten to undermine the autonomous part of my account. Because insofar as epistemic communitarianism requires an epistemic reliance on others, doesn't it give rise to a form of epistemic heteronomy? And so in a way, by entailing a form of epistemic dependence on others, epistemic communitarianism undermines the autonomy of the cognizer. So that's a good objection, but actually I think that it misunderstands what I was trying to argue as to what epistemic autonomy consists in. And so really, I think relying on testimony, for instance, is compatible with epistemic autonomy as I've defined it. So there's lots I could say to defend this claim, but because I'm running out of time, I'm going to be very brief. So I just want to say that you can rely on testimony and remain autonomous at the level of maxims, because a maxim allowing testimony would be a maxim like this: rely on testimony unless I have reasons to the contrary, something like that. What it suggests is that insofar as you still determine what to accept as an objective ground for your belief through your epistemic maxims, you're not actually deferring to someone else's authority or relinquishing your epistemic responsibility, because you are the one who assesses the credence of the person testifying, or the potential clash with other reliable evidence you may have, or your beliefs and so on. So in other words, insofar as you are the one who confers the authority to others, relying on testimony doesn't entail deferring my own authority. And that's why I think my account, or I hope my account of epistemic autonomy avoids the pitfall of heteronomy while requiring epistemic reliance on others. Oh, sorry, have I? Yes, sorry. But this is something I believe we'll return to in the response. So I'll leave it at that, and hopefully we can discuss it later. And so just to conclude, so I've tried to make a case for, or rather against, the claim that epistemic autonomy is a non-starter, and I've tried to convince you that it's actually quite a promising way of thinking about epistemic normativity. And so what I've done is I've put forward an account according to which the locus of responsibility is not beliefs, but the principles that regulate our beliefs. And I've argued that once we look at those principles, we can make sense of the claim that the only legitimate source of epistemic normativity is our capacity for autonomy, as I've defined it. And then I've tried to show that this broadly Kantian conception of epistemic autonomy doesn't fall prey to the most common objections against epistemic autonomy. And so I've showed that first, epistemic autonomy is not irrational, because rather than entailing individualism, it requires the epistemic contribution of others as its condition of possibility, what I've called communitarianism. And secondly, I've tried to show that epistemic autonomy is not inconsistent, because it does require the epistemic contribution of others, but it does so in a way that does not give rise to epistemic heteronomy. And I'll stop here. Thank you very much.